The silence of the high plains was a living thing, a predator that stalked the edges of hearing and fed on lonely thoughts. Elias Thorne knew its habits well. He had lived with it, wrestled it, and finally come to a grim understanding with it. It was a silence baked by a sun that bleached the very soul of the land, leaving behind the bones of mountains and the grit of endless dust. His hands, calloused and mapped with the fine lines of 1,000 repairs, tightened on the worn leather of the reins. The horse shifted beneath him, its breath a soft percussion against the vast, empty score of the afternoon. From his vantage on the low ridge, the homestead was a collection of hard lines and weathered wood, a stubborn knot of human will tied against the unraveling fabric of the wilderness. It was his. It was his burden and his sanctuary. He saw the dust cloud first, a faint, agitated plume rising miles to the east, where the stage road scarred the earth. It was too small for a freight wagon, too deliberate for a stray gust of wind. A single rider, maybe two, or the weekly stage running late. His jaw tightened. Visitors were a disruption, a stone tossed into the still, deep well of his routine. He preferred the company of his cattle, his horses, and the ghosts that whispered in the wind that scoured the canyons. He nudged his horse forward, descending the ridge in a slow, controlled slide of scree and dry soil. The air tasted of baked earth and the faint, bitter scent of sagebrush. By the time he reached the valley floor, the homestead was drawing nearer, and the dust cloud had resolved itself into the unmistakable shape of the conquered stagecoach, looking like a beetle crawling across a skillet. It was not supposed to be there. Not on his land. The main road was 5 miles south. His brothers, Caleb and Jonah, were already in the yard, their forms stiff with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Caleb, the elder, wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers, his face a mask of nervous bravado. Jonah, younger and softer, kicked at a loose stone, unable to meet Elias's approaching gaze. A cold knot formed in Elias's gut. This had their fingerprints all over it. Their clumsy, well-meaning, and utterly disastrous meddling. He swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped, the impact jarring up his spine. The air was thick with the scent of hot metal from the coach's wheel rims and the sweat of 4 tired horses. The coach door creaked open, a sound like a pained groan. A man in a dusty coat stepped out, then turned to offer a hand. From the shadowed interior, a figure emerged, small and slender, moving with a fluid grace that seemed alien to this land of abrupt, jarring movements. She was dressed in dark, practical silk, the fabric strangely resilient to the dust that coated everything else. Her face was a pale oval, her features delicate but composed, her black hair pulled back in a severe, intricate knot. She was Chinese. Her eyes, dark and impossibly deep, swept over the hardscrabble yard, the ramshackle porch, the 3 watching men, and betrayed nothing. Not fear, not disappointment, not hope, nothing. Caleb cleared his throat, the sound loud and abrasive in the sudden, heavy silence. "Elias, there was a letter from a service in San Francisco." He stumbled over the words, his earlier bravado melting under Elias's flat, cold stare. "For a wife, for you, to help around the place." Jonah finally looked up, his expression pleading. "We thought, you're alone so much. We thought it would be a good thing." A wife. They had ordered him a wife from a catalog like a new plow or a sack of seed. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it stole his breath. He looked from his brothers' guilty faces to the woman. She stood perfectly still beside the coach, her hands clasped before her, her posture radiating a dignity that made the dusty yard feel like a throne room, and them the shuffling supplicants. The advertisement, he knew without asking, would have promised a hardy German or Irish girl, someone accustomed to hardship, with wide hips for birthing sons and strong hands for scrubbing floors. This woman was none of those things. She was a piece of fine porcelain set down in a blacksmith shop, and every instinct screamed that she was about to be shattered. "Send her back," Elias said, his voice low and raspy, the sound of stone grinding on stone. Caleb's face fell. "We can't. The passage was paid. It's an arrangement." "Your arrangement," Elias corrected, the words clipped and dangerous. He saw the flicker of shame in their eyes, but it was overshadowed by the looming, intractable problem of the woman standing 5 feet away, a silent testament to their folly. The coach driver, sensing a storm he wanted no part of, was already starting to unload a small, sturdy trunk. The finality of the act was like a hammer blow. She was here. She was staying. The brothers looked at her, then at the ground, then at each other. They saw a problem, an embarrassment, a creature so foreign she might as well have descended from the moon. Their silence was thick with prejudice and confusion. Elias saw something else. He saw a person, displaced and alone, dropped into a cage she did not build. His anger at his brothers was a white-hot fire, but it was a familiar fire, one he could control. This situation, however, was a flood, and it threatened to drown them all in its complications. He let out a long, slow breath, the air burning his lungs. The sun beat down, merciless. The silence stretched, becoming a fourth person in the yard, judging them all. Finally, he moved, his boots crunching in the dirt. He walked past his brothers, stopping a few feet from her. He did not look at her face, but at the horizon beyond, at the bruised purple line of the distant mountains. He was responsible for this place, for these fools, and now, it seemed, for her. The thought was a lead weight in his soul. He turned his head just enough to address his brothers, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion but a profound, weary resignation. "Bring the Chinese girl inside." Caleb and Jonah went silent. They had expected him to rage, to curse them, to throw them off the land. They had expected him to refuse, to leave her standing in the dust until the coach was forced to take her back. They had not expected this quiet, immediate acceptance of an impossible reality. It was not kindness in his voice, it was command. It was the sound of a man taking up a burden he never asked for, because dropping it was not an option. They looked at each other, their shared guilt a palpable thing, and then, slowly, they moved to obey. The storm arrived that night, not with the grace of rain, but with the fury of wind. It came screaming down from the mountains, a raw physical force that clawed at the shingles and rattled the window panes in their frames. Dust, fine as flour, seeped through every crack in the old house, coating surfaces with a gritty film and making the air thick and hard to breathe. The world outside the small lamp-lit kitchen was reduced to a roaring, chaotic darkness. Inside, the silence was just as loud. Mei Ling, as they had learned her name was, sat at the rough-hewn table. She had not spoken more than a handful of words since her arrival, answering direct questions with a quiet yes or no in precise, carefully accented English. She had eaten the bland stew Jonah had prepared without complaint, her movements economical and deliberate. Now she sat with her back straight, her hands resting in her lap, a small, still island in the sea of the Thorne brothers' awkwardness. Caleb and Jonah kept casting furtive glances at her, then at Elias, who seemed carved from the same stoic wood as the table itself. He cleaned his rifle with slow, methodical strokes, the scent of gun oil and solvent cutting through the smell of dust and old smoke. The arrangement was impossible. The next stage wasn't due for a week, and with this storm, it might be even longer. She was trapped here, and they were trapped with her. In the morning, Caleb, in a clumsy attempt to assert some kind of order, had decided to put her to the test. He saw her slender frame, her clean hands, her silk attire now smudged with the grime of the house, and he saw weakness. He saw a liability. "The seed stores need sorting," he had announced, his voice overloud in the tense morning air. "Got all mixed up during the last supply run. Need to be weighed and rebagged before the damp gets to them." It was a miserable, thankless job. The storeroom was a chaotic mess of half-empty burlap sacks, spilled grain, and the fine, itchy dust that came with it. It was heavy, dirty work, meant to break her spirit, to prove to Elias that she was useless, that sending her away was the only logical choice. Jonah had looked uneasy, but he did not challenge his older brother. Elias had simply watched, his face an unreadable mask, before pulling on his hat and heading out to check the fences before the storm hit full force. Mei Ling had simply inclined her head in a gesture of acknowledgement and followed Caleb to the storeroom. He had left her there with a scoop, a scale, and a pile of empty sacks, a smirk playing on his lips. He expected to find her defeated and covered in dust by midday, perhaps even in tears. When Elias returned in the late afternoon, the wind already beginning to howl, he found the kitchen empty. A pot of water was simmering on the stove, and the scent of something clean and herbal hung in the air. He walked to the storeroom, pushing open the heavy wooden door. The scene inside stopped him in his tracks. The chaos was gone. The sacks were no longer in a heap, but were stacked in neat, precise rows against the far wall, each one tied off with a specific, intricate knot and marked with a small, cryptic symbol drawn in charcoal on a shard of wood. The floor was swept clean. The air, while still dusty, was clear. Mei Ling stood by a small makeshift desk she had fashioned from 2 crates and a plank. Before her lay a ledger he hadn't seen in years, the pages filled with his own father's sprawling, barely legible script. She was not writing in it. She was making her own pages, taking loose sheets of paper from her trunk and filling them with columns of neat, compact characters and numbers. She moved with an unhurried, focused intensity. She was not merely sorting grain. She was imposing a new logical order on their world. She looked up as he entered, her dark eyes meeting his. She did not seem startled or defensive. The inventory was inefficient, she stated, her voice calm and even. It was not an accusation, but a simple observation of fact. There was significant spoilage from moisture and pests. I have separated the viable seed by type and year. The new storage pattern minimizes exposure. The knots indicate the content. The symbols, the date of purchase. It will prevent using old seed first. Your ledger is based on cost. Mine is based on yield potential and shelf life. Elias stared at the organized room, at the neat columns of her script. It was more than organization. It was strategy. She had analyzed a problem and engineered a solution that was breathtaking in its simple, brutal efficiency. He had spent years wrestling with the chaotic legacy his father had left, the mismatched records, the wasteful guesswork. In a single afternoon, this woman, this stranger, had cut through the knot he had never been able to untangle. He saw Caleb and Jonah watching from the doorway behind him, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. The test she was meant to fail, she had passed with a mastery that exposed their own inadequacies. The smirk was long gone from Caleb's face, replaced by dawning, grudging respect. Elias said nothing. He simply looked at her, at the quiet intelligence burning in her eyes, and for the first time he saw not a problem but a possibility. He gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledgment that was, for him, as eloquent as a speech. He turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. A fragile truce had been declared, not with words, but with the quiet language of competence. He sat at the kitchen table, picking up his rifle again, but he was no longer just cleaning it. He was observing. He was reassessing everything. And in the corner of his eye, he watched the woman who was supposed to be his wife and wondered what other hidden depths lay beneath that still, silent surface. The storm passed, leaving the world scoured clean and unnervingly quiet. For days, an uneasy peace settled over the homestead. Mei Ling moved through their lives with a silent efficiency that was both unnerving and indispensable. She did not cook or clean in the way a hired girl might. Instead, she reorganized. The kitchen became a model of logic, with utensils and supplies arranged for maximum utility. The account books, once a source of constant frustration for Elias, were balanced, cross-referenced, and supplemented with projections of future expenses he had never even considered. She spoke little, but her actions spoke volumes. She was not a domestic servant. She was a quartermaster, a strategist, bringing order to their beleaguered fortress. Caleb and Jonah, their initial hostility replaced by a wary respect, began to defer to her in small ways. They would ask her where a tool was stored or how much feed was left for the winter, and she would answer without looking up from her ledgers, her knowledge of their own home already more complete than theirs. Elias watched it all, his silence a deep, contemplative thing. He had spent his life believing that self-reliance was the only virtue that mattered. To rely on another felt like a weakness. Yet he could not deny the subtle, powerful shift in the ranch's fortunes since her arrival. A weight was being lifted from his shoulders, a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The first real intrusion from the outside world came 2 weeks after her arrival. They needed supplies, and the trip to the town of Redemption was unavoidable. Elias rode the wagon, with Jonah beside him for security. Mei Ling had insisted on coming. "I must understand the supply chain," she had said, framing it as a matter of logistics. Elias knew it was more than that. She needed to see the world she had entered. He agreed with a curt nod, ignoring Caleb's worried glance. Redemption was a town gasping for air in a sea of dust. It was a single street of false-fronted buildings, baked and peeling under the relentless sun. As their wagon rolled down the main thoroughfare, a hush fell over the usual bustle. Doors creaked open, faces appeared in windows. The townspeople stared, their gazes a mixture of raw curiosity and undisguised suspicion. They stared at the strange, silent woman sitting beside Elias Thorne, a man known for his fierce solitude. Their whispers followed the wagon like a cloud of flies. The community was a Greek chorus, and their verdict was already being rendered. She did not belong. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and patent medicine. The proprietor, a man with a perpetually worried expression, served them with a forced, nervous politeness. But it was the arrival of another man that truly curdled the atmosphere. Silas Thorne entered the store as if he owned it, which, Elias knew, he nearly did. He was a large man, soft in the way of men who have others do their hard work, but his eyes were small and sharp, missing nothing. He was a distant cousin of Elias's father, a connection Silas used to claim a false familiarity, and Elias ignored with cold disdain. Silas owned the largest ranch in the territory, and more importantly, he owned the river. He controlled the water, and in this land, that meant he controlled life itself. His gaze fell upon Elias, then slid to Mei Ling, who stood examining a bolt of canvas, her expression serene. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across Silas's face. "Elias," he boomed, his voice oozing a condescending warmth. "I heard you'd acquired new help. Didn't realize you were in the market for such exotic goods." The insult, wrapped in the thin paper of a jest, hung in the air. The other patrons in the store fell silent, watching. Elias felt a familiar, cold rage begin to build in his chest. He did not rise to the bait. He simply stared at Silas, his eyes flat and gray as worn stone. "I'm not in the market for anything, Silas, just supplies." Silas chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. He took a step closer, his bulk crowding them. He looked Mei Ling up and down, his eyes lingering in a way that made Elias's hand drift instinctively closer to the Colt holstered at his hip. "A man in your position, with that scrappy little plot, you have to be careful. The well on your land is the last independent water source in this valley, a valuable asset. It would be a tragedy if something were to happen to it, or to the people living there. Accidents happen, fires, especially when a place has unusual distractions." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare on the floor of the general store for all to see. He was not just threatening Elias's land. He was threatening Mei Ling. He was using her presence, her otherness, as a weapon, painting a target on her back and on the entire homestead. He was turning the community's suspicion into a justification for his own greed. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that rose on Elias's neck. He was being made a spectacle of, his life and his choices held up for public judgment by a man he despised. Jonah shifted his weight, his hand resting on his own pistol, his young face pale with anger. But Elias gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. This was not the time or place. A fight here would only prove Silas's point, casting them as unstable and dangerous. Mei Ling, who had remained still throughout the exchange, finally turned. She did not look at Silas with fear or anger. She looked at him with the cool, detached curiosity of an entomologist studying a particularly repulsive insect. Her gaze was so unnervingly calm, so devoid of the reaction he was trying to provoke, that Silas's smirk faltered for a moment. She had not given him the satisfaction of her fear. Elias paid for their supplies, his movements stiff and deliberate. He gathered their things and walked out of the store, Mei Ling and Jonah following close behind. He did not look back, but he could feel the weight of every eye in town on them. The external threat was no longer a vague possibility. It had a name, a face, and it had made its intentions clear. The fragile piece of their isolated world had been shattered. Now it was a matter of survival. The ride back to the homestead was silent, but the silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the grim certainty of a coming war. The attack came 3 nights later, under the sliver of a dead moon. There was no warning, just the sudden frantic barking of the dog followed by the acrid smell of smoke on the night air. Elias was out of his cot in an instant, pulling on his boots and grabbing the shotgun he kept loaded by the door. The orange glow flickering against his window told him everything he needed to know. It was the barn. He burst out into the yard, the cold night air a shock to his lungs. Flames were already licking up the dry, seasoned wood of the barn's western wall, greedily consuming the structure that housed their livestock, their tools, their entire livelihood. Caleb and Jonah were right behind him, their faces stark and pale in the demonic light. In the distance, Elias heard the thunder of retreating horses. Silas Thorne's cowards did their work in the dark. Panic was a wild animal, threatening to stampede through his mind. The horses, trapped in the corral next to the barn, were screaming in terror. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, a hissing, roaring dragon of destruction. His first instinct, and that of his brothers, was a primal, desperate urge to simply throw buckets of water at the inferno, a futile gesture against such a powerful foe. It was Mei Ling's voice that cut through the chaos. It was not loud, but it was sharp and clear, imbued with an authority that stopped them all in their tracks. "Elias, the horses, they will bolt or burn. Get them out. Caleb, the well pump. Jonah, every bucket, trough, and barrel you can find. Line them up here." She pointed to a spot a safe distance from the barn. "Not there. Create a chain. Do not waste a single drop." She was not screaming or panicking. She stood on the porch, her small frame silhouetted against the fire, and she was commanding them. Her mind, in the midst of fire and fear, was not seeing a disaster. It was seeing a tactical problem, a logistical challenge to be solved. There was no time to question it. The sheer certainty in her voice was an anchor in the swirling madness. Elias ran for the corral, his heart pounding against his ribs. The heat from the barn was a physical blow, scorching his skin. He ripped open the gate, yelling, using his body to herd the terrified rearing animals out into the relative safety of the open pasture. He worked with a brutal efficiency born of years of handling panicked livestock, his focus narrowed to the single life-or-death task. Behind him, he could hear Mei Ling's voice continuing its calm, relentless cadence of commands. She was directing Caleb and Jonah not just to fight the fire, but how to fight it. "Focus on the house roof. The embers are catching. Forget the barn wall, it is lost. Protect what we can still save. Jonah, soak those blankets. Caleb, get on the roof and smother the sparks." They obeyed without hesitation. The raw, directionless panic was gone, replaced by a desperate, coordinated effort. They became a single unit, directed by her strategic mind. Elias, having freed the horses, joined the bucket chain. He saw Mei Ling then, not on the porch, but in the thick of it, her face smudged with soot, her silk sleeves rolled up. She was not carrying water herself. She was watching everything, her eyes darting from the direction of the wind to the pattern of the fallen embers, adjusting their strategy on the fly. "The wind is shifting. Move the water line to the east. Protect the workshop." Elias had always been the one in charge, the one whose strength and will held the ranch together. But in this moment of crisis, he was following her lead. He saw his own competence, his physical prowess, as a tool that she was wielding with remarkable precision. He was the sword, but she was the hand that guided it. He watched her point, her mind 3 steps ahead of the fire, anticipating its every move. She saw the whole battlefield, while they had only seen the immediate flame in front of them. For what felt like an eternity, they fought. They fought the fire, their own exhaustion, and the creeping despair. The barn was a total loss, its frame collapsing into a roaring pyre that sent a shower of sparks into the black sky. But the house stood. The workshop was safe. The livestock were alive. They had held the line. As the fire finally began to die down, its hunger sated. They collapsed in the dirt, chests heaving, bodies aching, faces and clothes black with soot and grime. The partnership that had been fragile and unspoken was now forged solid in the crucible of the fire. They had been forced to rely on each other, to trust each other completely, just to survive. Elias looked at Mei Ling, who was staring at the smoldering ruins of the barn, her expression grim but resolute. The transactional arrangement, the mail-order misunderstanding, had burned away with the barn. What was left in its place was something far stronger, a partnership for survival. And as he looked at her, he realized with a startling clarity that he was no longer just protecting his land. He was protecting her. The thought did not feel like a burden. It felt like a purpose. The dawn broke over a landscape of devastation. The rising sun illuminated the blackened, skeletal remains of the barn, a gaping wound in the heart of the homestead. The smell of wet ash and charred wood hung heavy in the air, a funeral shroud over the mourning. An exhausted silence had fallen over the four of them. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, aching weariness and the cold, hard reality of their loss. They had saved the house, but Silas Thorne had drawn his line. This was no longer a war of intimidation. It was a war of annihilation. He would not stop until he had broken them and taken the land. Elias knew this with a bone-deep certainty. He paced the yard, his mind a whirlwind of grim calculations. Thorne had more men, more money, more power. A direct confrontation was suicide. The law and redemption was a joke, a puppet dancing on Silas's strings. They were utterly, completely alone. He saw Mei Ling watching him from the porch steps. She was holding a cup of tea, the steam rising in the cool morning air. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, unnerving intensity. "He will come back," she said. It was not a question. "He will," Elias confirmed, his voice a low rasp, "and he'll bring everyone he has next time. He won't leave it to chance." "Then we must not leave it to chance either," she replied, her gaze steady. She took a sip of her tea, a gesture of such profound calm it seemed almost surreal against the backdrop of ruin. "Elias, your father's journals, the ones in the storeroom, I have read them." Elias stopped pacing. He looked at her, confused. "They're just ranching logs, breeding lines, crop yields, nothing of use." "They are more than that," she said, rising and walking towards him. He was a meticulous man. He recorded everything, including his disputes. 20 years ago, he had a legal conflict with Silas Thorne's father over the very same water rights. It went before a territorial judge. She paused, letting the words sink in. "Your father won." He recorded the name of the judge, the date of the ruling, and the case file number from the federal land office. He even made a copy of the final decree. He wrote that he kept it somewhere safe. Elias stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she was saying. A legal decree, a federal ruling. It was a ghost, a half-forgotten story from his childhood he'd dismissed as bitter rambling. "It changes nothing," he said, the hope she offered feeling too fragile to touch. "Silas owns the town. A piece of paper won't stop his men." "It is not for his men," Mei Ling said, her voice dropping, becoming more urgent. "It is for the railroad." Elias looked at her, uncomprehending. "The Transcontinental Railroad Survey Team is in redemption. I saw their notice in the general store. They're buying up rights of way. They need water for their engines, and they will not bow to a local tyrant if the federal government has already ruled against him. That piece of paper is not a shield. It is a sword. It gives us an ally with more power than Silas Thorne could ever dream of." Suddenly, the great unmasking began, not of her identity, but of the full scope of her mind. She saw connections he never could, piecing together fragments of information, a dusty journal, a notice on a wall, into a coherent, powerful strategy. But there was more. "There is another reason Silas is so desperate," she continued, her eyes holding his. "The man who arranged my passage from San Francisco, he was corrupt. He stole from those he was supposed to help. My father was a military official in the Qing court. He foresaw the coming turmoil, and he entrusted this agent with his entire fortune, smuggled out of the country to be given to me upon my arrival. Silas learned of this. He does not just want your water, Elias. He believes I am carrying a fortune in gold. He thinks he can take your land and my money from two people the world sees as helpless." The full, ugly picture snapped into focus. The targeted insults, the relentless pressure, the escalation to violence. It was all a calculated campaign of predatory greed. He was not just fighting a land baron. He was fighting a thief who believed them to be easy prey. "He is wrong," Elias said, the words coming out like chips of granite. "I know," she replied. "We will let him believe he is right. We will let him come." And so they prepared. It was Mei Ling who drew the plan in the dirt with a stick, a map of the homestead and the surrounding terrain. Her knowledge of tactics, learned from a father she spoke of with quiet, profound reverence, was astonishing. She turned their ranch into a fortress. They dug trenches in the dark, built barricades from salvaged barnwood and overturned wagons. They positioned themselves not in the house, a single, vulnerable target, but across the property, using the rocky outcrops and the deep irrigation ditch as natural defenses. It was a plan based on misdirection, attrition, and the element of surprise. Thorne and his dozen riders arrived just after midday, as predicted. They came not with the subtlety of arsonists in the night, but with the open arrogance of conquerors, riding into the yard as if they already owned it. They found the place eerily silent. The house appeared deserted. "Thorne!" Elias's voice boomed from the rocks above the house. He stood alone, in plain sight, a rifle in his hands. "This is your only warning. Leave." Silas Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet valley. "Brave words, farmer. Give me the girl and the deed to this land, and I might let you and your witless brothers live." It was the signal. From the workshop, Jonah opened fire, not at the men, but at a stack of old metal barrels they had filled with rocks. The sound was deafening, a monstrous clatter that spooked the horses and sowed instant confusion. As Thorne's men struggled to control their mounts, Caleb opened up from the irrigation ditch on the opposite flank. They were caught in a crossfire, a kill box of their own making. The fight was fast, brutal, and decisive. Thorne's men were thugs and bullies, not soldiers. They were used to intimidating unarmed homesteaders, not fighting a coordinated defense. Faced with disciplined fire from unseen positions, they broke. Some fled, others were shot from their saddles. Silas, his face purple with rage, saw his victory dissolving into a humiliating rout. He spurred his horse directly toward the house, pulling his pistol, his eyes wild with greed and fury. He was focused on the front door, believing Mei Ling was cowering inside. He never saw her. She stepped out from the deep shadow of the porch, not with a rifle, but with the heavy Colt that had belonged to Elias's father. She held it with a two-handed grip, her stance perfectly balanced, her expression utterly calm. Thorne raised his pistol, but he was too slow. Her shot was a single, definitive crack that echoed across the yard. Silas jerked in the saddle, a look of pure shock on his face before toppling to the ground. The tyrant was defeated, not by a gunslinger's bravado, but by the cold, precise calculus of an underestimated woman. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, Elias scrambled down from the rocks. He ran past the body of Silas Thorne, his eyes only for Mei Ling. He saw the tremor in her hands as she lowered the heavy pistol. He reached her just as a wave of delayed shock hit him, a sharp, searing pain in his left arm where a stray bullet had grazed him. He stumbled, and she was there, catching him. She guided him to the porch steps, her strength surprising. Without a word, she tore a strip from her own clothing and began to tend to the wound, her touch gentle but firm. The chaos and violence of the last hour faded away, replaced by this quiet, intimate moment. He looked at her, truly looked at her, at the soot on her cheek, the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the unwavering strength that had saved them all. The lie of the mail-order bride was gone. The misunderstanding of the helpless foreigner was gone. All that remained was the woman herself, his partner, his savior. He reached out with his good hand and gently brushed the soot from her face. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze, a new contract was signed, a new future defined. Weeks bled into a month, and the raw, wounded landscape of the homestead began to heal. The sun, once a merciless tyrant, now seemed gentler, its light falling on the green shoots of new grass pushing up through the scorched earth. The skeletal remains of the barn had been cleared, the salvaged wood stacked neatly, awaiting a new purpose. The railroad surveyors had come, armed with Mei Ling's information and the 20-year-old legal decree she had found tucked inside a hollowed-out book in Elias's father's desk. The Thorne Empire, built on bullying and stolen water, crumbled overnight. The valley breathed a collective sigh of relief, and the whispers in the town of redemption changed from suspicion to something that sounded a great deal like awe. A new status quo had settled over the ranch. It was a rhythm of quiet, shared work. Caleb and Jonah, their boisterousness tempered by a profound respect, now looked to Mei Ling not as their brother's strange wife, but as the undisputed master of the homestead strategy. They were rebuilding, but they were building something different now, something stronger. Mei Ling's ledgers were not just records of accounts. They were blueprints for a future, detailing crop rotations, water management strategies, and market opportunities Elias had never had the vision to see. The ranch was not just surviving, it was preparing to thrive. One cool evening, as a bruised purple sky settled over the mountains, Elias found Mei Ling not at her desk, but in a small protected patch of earth beside the house. She had tilled the soil herself, her hands, once so clean, now smudged with the rich, dark dirt. She was planting something, carefully placing small, delicate seedlings into the ground. He came and stood beside her, watching. The air was still, fragrant with the scent of damp earth and the promise of new life. He knelt, picking up a small trowel, and began to help her, mirroring her movements. They worked in a comfortable silence, their hands moving in concert. It was not a chore of survival, like mending a fence or digging a trench. This was an act of faith. It was the planting of a garden, a symbolic gesture of putting down roots, of believing in a future peaceful enough to nurture something so fragile. He did not know what the strange, fragrant herbs were, but he knew they were from her home, a piece of a world she had left behind, now being planted in this new soil. When the last seedling was in the ground, they stood and looked at their work. The small, orderly patch was a testament to their shared effort, a small green promise in the vast, rugged landscape. A home, they were both learning, was not just a plot of land or a shelter from the storms. It was a space two people built together, a fortress against the world's harshness, but also a garden where new things could grow. It was a partnership forged in fire, tested by violence, and now, in the quiet aftermath, blooming into something more. Elias turned to her. The setting sun caught the sharp, intelligent lines of her face, softening them. The profound loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years felt distant now, a ghost from another life. He thought of the man he was before she arrived, isolated, emotionally guarded, convinced he needed no one. He had been wrong. He needed her, not just her mind or her strength, but her presence. She had not just saved his ranch. She had saved him from the prison of his own solitude. He looked out at the vast expanse of their land, at the house they had defended together, at the darkening sky. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it held the weight of an oath. It was a statement of fact, an observation, and a proposal all at once. "This is a good place," he said. He paused, then his gaze moved from the land and settled on her, holding her eyes. "Our place." The words hung in the still air, simple, practical, and more profound than any flowery poetry. It was an understated commitment, a declaration grounded in the earth beneath their feet. Mei Ling held his gaze, and for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, a genuine, unguarded smile reached her eyes, crinkling their corners. It was a smile of acceptance, of arrival, of finally being home. She gave a single, slow nod. It was all the answer he needed. Together, they turned and walked back toward the house, their shadows merging into one as they went inside to face the future they would now build together. A home, they had both learned, was not a plot of land defined by fences, but a partnership defined by trust. It was not a shelter from the storm, but the person who stands with you in the heart of it. For Elias and Mei Ling, their small ranch on the high plains became more than just a place to live. It became the world they had built, a testament to the idea that even in the harshest of landscapes, the most unexpected seeds of hope can take root and flourish. If you stayed with me all the way through this story of hardship and healing, thank you. Your time and attention are the greatest compliments a storyteller can receive. We all face our own frontiers, and sometimes the greatest strength is found in the partnerships we never expected. If their journey resonated with you, I hope you'll consider hitting that like button, as it truly helps others discover these stories. And to make sure you do not miss the next tale we have to share, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We have many more journeys waiting to be told. Until then, take care of yourself and the people who help make your piece of the world a home.